Inside the darkness of Rikers Island. The night the lights went out. Imagine this. It's the middle of the night inside one of the most notorious prisons in America. The air is heavy, the cells are silent, and every sound echoes like a warning. Suddenly, the entire prison plunges into complete darkness. The hum of the fluorescent lights disappears, leaving only the sound of breathing, footsteps, and whispered voices. The blackout doesn't just turn off the lights, it unlocks fear. Guards clutch their radios, but static answers back. Inside the cells, inmates sense opportunity. Some whisper plans. Others sharpen hidden blades against the floor. Then, chaos erupts. A guard's flashlight cuts through the dark just in time to reveal a pool of blood spreading across the concrete. An inmate screams in pain. Another laughs in the shadows. Shouts of "lockdown" fill the air, but in that moment, Rikers Island isn't under control. It belongs to the darkness. This is the real Rikers Island. Not the one you see on paper, but the one that survives in the shadows, fueled by violence, fear, and silence. The question is, how did it get here? And why does Rikers remain one of the darkest corners of America's prison system? To answer that, we have to go back. A city of chains. Rikers Island sits in the East River, between Queens and the Bronx, but it might as well be a world away. Over 400 acres of razor wire, guard towers, and crumbling buildings form a city of confinement. More than 10,000 people once lived here at a time. Men, women, and even children. Some are awaiting trial, not yet convicted of a crime. Others are serving short sentences. All are trapped in a system infamous for its brutality. The journey begins the moment you arrive. Buses ferry shackled inmates over the bridge that connects Rikers to the outside world. For many, that ride feels like crossing into another reality. The skyline of New York fades behind them, and what waits ahead is a place where rules are written not by the state, but by survival. Intake is the first taste of that reality. Dozens of inmates are crammed into holding pens, shoulder to shoulder, sweating in the heat. The smell of fear and desperation mixes with the echo of distant shouts. Everyone sizes each other up, because in Rikers, weakness is blood in the water. Once inside the blocks, the daily rhythm is deceptively ordinary. Guards march down corridors. Breakfast trays slide through metal slots. Phones line the walls in the day rooms. But beneath that routine, something darker simmers. The gangs run the phones. They control who eats, who sleeps safely, and who gets hurt. That isn't settled with money, it's settled with fists, blades, or worse. For a few days, things might seem calm. New inmates learn the rules. Don't snitch, don't stare too long, and don't ever owe anyone a favor. But calm never lasts at Rikers. The pressure builds in silence until it finally explodes. One summer afternoon, inside a crowded dorm, it happened. A simple argument over a stolen radio lit the spark. Two inmates shouted, then shoved, and within seconds, the entire dorm erupted. Dozens of men surged forward. Fists crashed into faces. Bodies slammed against bunks. Some pulled out sharpened toothbrushes, swinging them like knives. The guards stormed in, batons raised, shouting commands. But the chaos swallowed their voices. Blood splattered the walls as rival groups clashed. It wasn't just a fight, it was a declaration of power. Every punch, every stab, every scream was a reminder. In Rikers, you survive by showing strength. By the time the dorm was secured, the floor was slick with blood and sweat. Inmates sat in silence, eyes cold, some smiling through split lips. The guards dragged away the injured, but the message was clear. Inside the darkness of Rikers, violence isn't the exception, it's the rule. And that was only the beginning. Silence before the storm. The fight over the radio left scars, but at Rikers, scars are just another kind of language. Inmates didn't talk much about what happened that day. They didn't have to. The bruises on faces, the stitches across foreheads, the bandaged arms, those were the conversations. For a while, things grew quiet. Too quiet. Meals came and went. The clanging of steel doors marked time. In the yard, men played cards, walked in slow circles, or stared out at the razor wire fences that separated them from the city skyline. To a guard, it might have looked like peace. But to those inside, it was something else. It was waiting. Because at Rikers, violence never ends with the first blow. It waits. It plans. And when it comes back, it's louder, harder, and more brutal. Whispers filled the dorms, rumors of retaliation. The gang whose member had been jumped in the radio fight wasn't going to let it slide. They never do. Some inmates started avoiding the phones. Others skipped meals. Everyone felt the tension climbing, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then, one evening, during rec time in the yard, the storm finally broke. It started with two men locking eyes. One from the dorm where the radio fight began. The other, a known shot caller for his crew. At first, it looked like just another stare down. But then, suddenly he pulled a shank. The blade caught the light of the setting sun, and before anyone could move, he lunged. The yard exploded. Dozens of inmates surged like a wave. Some fought. Others ran. Guards blew whistles, sprinting in with batons raised. Shouts of "Get down" were drowned out by the chaos. Blood splattered the pavement. One man dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach. Another swung wildly, his blade cutting through air and skin alike. From the watchtower above, floodlights snapped on, sweeping across the chaos. Sirens blared, echoing across the island. But down below, on the yard's concrete, it was too late. The message had already been sent. Retaliation had arrived. When order was finally restored, dozens of men were bloodied and bruised. A handful were taken away on stretchers. And in the middle of it all, those who weren't hurt just stared in silence. In their eyes was the truth. This wasn't just a prison fight. This was Rikers reminding everyone of its most important rule. Inside these walls, the cycle of violence never ends. And yet, the worst was still to come. Lockdown shadows. After the yard riot, Rikers Island went into full lockdown. Every door slammed shut. The metallic echo carried through the blocks like thunder. Guards marched up and down the tiers, flashlights cutting through the dim light, barking orders at anyone who moved too slowly. Meals were shoved through slots in the cell doors. The yard stayed empty. Phones went silent. From the outside, it looked like control had been restored. But inside the cells, the silence was dangerous. Inmates replayed every moment of the fight in their heads. Who swung first? Who got cut? Who was still breathing? In Rikers, silence isn't peace, it's plotting. For the guards, lockdown meant walking into a pressure cooker. They could feel it in the air, eyes staring at them through narrow cell windows, whispers traveling from cell to cell. Some inmates tapped on pipes, sending coded messages across the block. The tension wasn't gone. It was waiting, building, becoming sharper by the hour. Days dragged into nights. The routine became suffocating. Some inmates banged on their doors until their knuckles bled. Others sat in silence, staring into the dark. A few prayed. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the next eruption. And then it came. During a routine escort, 2 guards were moving an inmate through a hallway lined with cells. At first, it was quiet. Just the sound of shackles scraping against the floor. Then, out of nowhere, an arm shot through the bars. A sharpened piece of metal slashed across the officer's face. The hallway exploded with noise. Inmates screamed, pounding their doors, shouting insults. The guards wrestled the bleeding officer to safety as alarms blared. In the chaos, the shackled inmate twisted free, lunging at the second officer, slamming him against the wall before backup rushed in. Blood stained the concrete. Radios screamed with urgent calls. Reinforcements stormed the corridor, tackling the inmate to the ground. The officer's face dripped red as he was rushed out. And just like that, the prison shifted again. The violence was no longer just inmate against inmate. It had crossed the line. Guards were targets now. The balance of control tilted, and everyone inside knew it. That night, Rikers was quieter than ever. Not because there was peace, but because every man behind those bars was thinking the same thing. If the officers weren't safe, who was? The price of silence. The attack on the guards sent shockwaves through the island. 4 days, officers walked their rounds with heavier hands on their batons and tighter grips on their radios. Every escort was doubled, sometimes tripled. But in truth, the guards were just as shaken as the inmates. If one officer could be cut so easily, what else could happen? The administration's answer was more lockdowns. Units stayed sealed. Showers were shortened. Phone time was cut off. But that only fanned the flames. To inmates, lockdown wasn't punishment, it was fuel. With nothing but time on their hands, they replayed grudges, debts, and insults like looping tapes in their minds. In the dorms, tension hung heavy. Even in silence, you could feel it. Eyes watched from bunks. Conversations dropped when guards passed by. The walls seemed to absorb the anger, pulsing with it, waiting for it to break free again. And yet, the darkest thing about Rikers wasn't always the violence itself. It was the silence that followed. When the officer was slashed, not one inmate spoke. Not one voice admitted what they saw. Even those who weren't involved said nothing. Because inside Rikers, silence is survival. Talking gets you killed. Looking too long gets you noticed. And once you're noticed, you're marked. The guards knew this too. They shouted questions. They threatened longer lockdowns. They promised privileges for answers. But all they got was blank stares. No one admitted anything. Not because they didn't know, but because in Rikers, silence speaks louder than words. And then the silence cracked. One night, in the mess hall, an inmate refused to sit at his assigned table. To an outsider, it might seem like nothing. But at Rikers, the mess hall is divided by invisible lines: gang, burrow, loyalty. Sitting in the wrong place is a challenge, a declaration. At first, the room froze. Forks hovered over trays. Guards shifted uneasily. Then, in a blur, a tray flew across the room, smashing into another inmate's face. The room erupted. Dozens of men leapt from their seats. Tables crashed. Chairs swung like weapons. Fists pounded flesh. Trays shattered. Some men stabbed with sharpened sporks and broken plastic. Others kicked whoever was closest. Blood sprayed across the walls as guards rushed in, batons swinging, shouting orders that no one heard. The mess hall became a war zone. Inmates leapt on tables, tackling each other onto the concrete. Shouts echoed like thunder as more guards stormed in. The smell of food mixed with sweat and blood. By the time it ended, the mess hall was unrecognizable. Tables overturned, trays smashed, blood smeared across the floor. Dozens of men were dragged out in shackles, some bleeding, some grinning. And in the middle of it all, one truth hung heavy. Every fight, every attack, every riot was part of the same cycle. Silence. Tension. Explosion. At Rikers Island, the darkness never left, it only waited. Ambush in the dark. After the mess hall riot, the prison went back into lockdown. The halls smelled faintly of bleach, but no cleaning could wash away what happened. Guards walked faster now, their eyes darting at every shadow. Inmates moved with caution too, every man aware that another wave of violence could erupt at any moment. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Meals came late, often cold. Phone calls were restricted. The gym stayed closed. Some inmates lay on their bunks for hours, staring at the ceiling. Others whispered plans in the corners of their cells. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. But silence at Rikers is never empty, it's always waiting. The administration believed the lockdown had cooled things off. But the truth was, the storm was only gathering strength. The gangs had not forgotten. Retaliation was already being planned. Not in the open this time, not in the yard or mess hall where everyone could see, but in the shadows where guards had the least control. It happened during evening movement. A group of inmates was being escorted back from medical. The hallway was dim, lined with cells, echoing with footsteps and the rattle of chains. Everything seemed routine until it wasn't. From one of the cells, a voice shouted. The guards turned for just a second, and that was enough. In a flash, an inmate broke formation, lunging at the man in front of him. A sharpened piece of metal slashed across his back. The injured man stumbled, screaming, but before he could react, 3 more men were on him. The hallway exploded into chaos. Inmates banged on their doors, screaming and cheering. The attackers moved with precision, each strike quick and deliberate, blades flashing in the dim light. Blood sprayed against the walls as the guards struggled to pull the men apart. Radios crackled with desperate calls for backup. One guard swung his baton, striking wildly to regain control. Another dragged the bleeding inmate down the hall, leaving a trail of red. Sirens blared again, and boots thundered as reinforcements poured in. When the chaos finally ended, the floor was slick with blood. The injured man lay motionless, his body torn by multiple stab wounds. He was rushed out on a stretcher, guards shouting for medics, but the attackers stood stone-faced as they were slammed against the wall and cuffed. For the rest of the block, silence returned. But it wasn't peace. It was fear. Fear that the next target could be anyone. Fear that the darkness of Rikers was swallowing everyone, guards and inmates alike. And as the cells slammed shut again that night, everyone inside knew one thing. The cycle wasn't finished. The storm was still building. The riot that shook the island. The ambush in the hallway sent a shockwave through every tier of Rikers. Guards were rattled, inmates were restless, and the air itself felt dangerous. 4 days, the prison remained under strict lockdown. Cells stayed sealed around the clock. Meals were tossed in through slots, cold and rushed. Showers were cut down to minutes. Even medical visits were delayed unless life or death. It was supposed to smother the violence, but it only made the pressure worse. Inside those cells, tension brewed like a storm. Some men tapped coded messages through the pipes, others sent notes folded into scraps of toilet paper. Alliances were being forged, plans whispered from bunk to bunk. Everyone knew retaliation was still coming. It was just a matter of where and when. The guards sensed it too. They walked their rounds with one hand on their radios, the other on their batons. Their eyes scanned every shadow, every pair of watching eyes behind the bars. But knowing something is coming doesn't mean you can stop it. And then, Rikers exploded. It started in one dorm, late in the evening. An inmate shouted a phrase, coded, but understood. In seconds, dozens of men surged from their bunks. Fists flew. Shanks flashed. Metal chairs were ripped from the floor and swung like weapons. Guards rushed in, but the riot spread like wildfire. From dorm to dorm, inmates smashed lights, flipped bunks, and tore apart whatever they could. Radios crackled with chaos as officers screamed for backup. Within minutes, the entire block was alive with violence. Blood sprayed across the walls. Windows shattered. The sound of steel against steel echoed like war drums. Some inmates climbed on top of bunks, hurling objects across the room. Others tackled guards, dragging them into the melee. Floodlights snapped on from the watchtowers outside. Sirens blared across the island, a deafening alarm that carried to every corner of Rikers. Reinforcements stormed in, riot squads in helmets and shields, swinging batons, firing pepper spray into the chaos. The air grew thick with gas. Inmates coughed and choked, but many kept fighting, blinded, still swinging fists and blades. Smoke drifted across the dorm, mixing with the stench of sweat and blood. By the time order was wrestled back, the dorm looked like a battlefield. Walls cracked. Floors smeared with blood. Dozens of inmates lay cuffed on the ground, some wheezing, some silent. Guards stood bruised and bleeding, their uniforms ripped. It was one of the worst riots Rikers had seen in years. And as the last shouts faded into silence, one truth remained clear. The island wasn't just broken, it was bleeding from the inside. The cycle of darkness wasn't stopping. It was growing stronger. The hole and the breaking point. After the riot, the prison descended into a cold silence. The walls were scarred, the floors still stained, and the stench of pepper spray lingered in the air. Guards walked through the wreckage like soldiers after battle, their boots crunching over broken trays and shattered glass. The administration's response was swift: punishment. Dozens of inmates were dragged out, shackled, and thrown into solitary confinement, what they call the box. Small cells no bigger than a bathroom, with no window and no sound but your own breath. In solitary, time doesn't move. Days blur into nights. The silence eats at your mind until it feels like the walls are whispering. But even solitary didn't crush the spirit of Rikers. Inmates tapped messages through vents, shouted down hallways, and found ways to pass contraband notes. Punishment only deepened their anger. Meanwhile, the blocks that weren't in solitary grew tense again. Guards pushed harder, barking orders, dragging inmates into random searches, flipping bunks for hidden blades. Every corner felt like a trap. And the fear wasn't just between inmates anymore. It spread to the officers too. Some guards stopped walking alone. Others asked for transfers. Rumors spread about officers being targeted. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Then came the breaking point. One night, during evening movement, a group of inmates was escorted down a dim hallway. At first, it seemed routine, just another transfer back to the dorms. But suddenly, one inmate shoved a guard with his shoulder. In the blink of an eye, 3 others lunged. The guards were overwhelmed, dragged to the floor. Shouts echoed off the concrete as radios screamed for backup. One officer's keys clattered across the ground, snatched up in an instant. The inmates pinned another guard against the wall, fists pounding, blood splattering against his uniform. It was chaos, but it wasn't random. This was planned. The goal wasn't just violence. It was control. For a few terrifying minutes, the inmates ran that hallway. Other guards rushed in, batons swinging, pepper spray filling the air. The fight was brutal, bodies slamming against walls, boots stomping, fists cracking against bone. When the dust finally settled, one guard was unconscious, another bleeding heavily, and several inmates were dragged away half-broken, their faces battered but their eyes still burning with defiance. That night, whispers spread across the island. It wasn't just another fight. It wasn't just another riot. It was a warning. The balance of power at Rikers was slipping. The darkness wasn't just swallowing inmates anymore. It was reaching for the people sworn to keep control. Control slipping away. After the hallway ambush, Rikers Island became a fortress. Extra officers were brought in. Riot squads patrolled the corridors in helmets and shields. Cells were searched daily, sometimes twice. Inmates were forced to strip, bend, and squat during random checks. The message from the administration was clear. No one was safe, and no one would be spared from discipline. For a short while it worked. The blocks stayed quiet. The sound of doors slamming replaced the shouts of fights. Guards carried themselves with more authority, their radios crackling constantly with updates. On the surface, it looked like order was returning. But beneath that thin layer of control, anger boiled hotter than ever. Inmates whispered through vents and tapped on pipes, sharing plans in code. They were tired of the searches, tired of the strip checks, tired of the humiliation. To them, the crackdown wasn't control, it was provocation. Then came the spark. It began in solitary, the box. One inmate, locked down for weeks after the last riot, hadn't been heard from in hours. When guards opened his cell door, they found him unresponsive, slumped against the wall. He had taken his own life. Word spread fast. Whispers carried it from cell to cell, dorm to dorm. By the next morning, the whole island knew. And when Rikers learns of a death, especially in solitary, the response is never calm. That afternoon, during chow, a tray slid across the floor and crashed against the wall. Another followed. Then another. In seconds, the mess hall erupted. Inmates hurled trays, cups, and food at the guards. Some leapt onto tables, screaming curses. Others flipped benches and shoved each other aside in the chaos. The guards charged in, shields raised, batons swinging. Pepper spray hissed through the air. The room filled with choking gas, but the inmates didn't stop. They grabbed mop handles, broken trays, anything that could be used as a weapon. The sound was deafening, metal slamming against steel, fists pounding flesh, alarms blaring. One officer slipped and spilled food, and in an instant, 3 inmates were on him. He was dragged across the floor, fists raining down, blood staining his uniform. Radios screamed for backup as more guards stormed in. By the time the riot squad regained control, the mess hall looked like a war zone. Blood smeared across the walls, food splattered like paint, bodies cuffed and dragged out one by one. The death in solitary had lit the spark, but the riot had proved something even darker. The cycle of violence couldn't be stopped. Every time the prison tightened control, the pressure built until it burst. And now, everyone on the island, guards and inmates alike, knew the truth. Rikers wasn't just violent. It was out of control. Fire across the blocks. The mess hall riot left Rikers reeling. Guards were injured, inmates were bruised and bloodied, and the whole facility felt on edge. The administration doubled down on force. More lockdowns, more searches, more punishments. But instead of control, it bred fury. Inside the cells, inmates whispered in code. They weren't just talking about fights anymore, they were talking about unity. For once, rival crews and gangs shared the same anger. They weren't joining hands, but they were aligning their rage. Against the guards. Against the system. Against Rikers itself. For a few days, the prison seemed calm. The silence felt almost fragile. Guards breathed easier, hoping the worst had passed. But those who had been at Rikers long enough knew better. The calm wasn't peace. It was preparation. And then one night the storm broke. It started in a single dorm. An inmate set fire to a mattress. The flames climbed fast, thick smoke curling through the air. Guards rushed in with extinguishers, shouting orders. But at that exact moment, in another building, alarms blared. Another fight broke out. Then another. And another. Within minutes, multiple blocks across Rikers erupted in chaos. Doors slammed, fists flew, shouts rose like thunder. Inmates banged on their doors in rhythm, chanting, screaming, fueling the frenzy. Guards sprinted from one block to the next, radios blaring, trying desperately to keep up. In one unit, inmates ripped a steel bed frame from the floor, using it as a battering ram against doors. In another, a guard was cornered, his shield ripped away, fists raining down until reinforcements pulled him free. Smoke from burning mattresses choked the hallways, mixing with the bitter sting of pepper spray and tear gas. From the watchtowers outside, floodlights swept across the prison yards. Sirens wailed across the island. The chaos wasn't contained to one fight, one dorm, or one moment. It was everywhere, all at once. Hours passed before order was clawed back. Dozens of inmates were dragged away in cuffs, their faces bloodied but defiant. Guards stood battered, uniforms torn, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. When dawn broke, Rikers Island looked less like a correctional facility and more like a battlefield scarred by smoke, blood, and silence. And in that silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. Rikers wasn't just violent anymore. It was unraveling. The darkness wasn't creeping, it was consuming. Walls that can't hold. After the night of fire and chaos, Rikers Island felt like it was teetering on the edge of collapse. The administration scrambled to reassert control. Entire blocks were sealed. Solitary overflowed as dozens of men were crammed into cells meant for half that number. The air in those units was thick with sweat, mold, and anger. The official response was harsher than ever. Guards stomped down corridors in riot gear. Inmates were strip-searched 3, sometimes 4 times a day. Showers were cut back, phone calls nearly eliminated. On paper, these measures were supposed to suffocate rebellion. In reality, they lit the fuse for something darker. Because at Rikers, every punishment creates another grudge. Every strip search deepens the hate. Every slammed door is a promise that revenge is coming. Inmates began whispering of escape. Not because they thought they could actually make it off the island. Most knew the water, the fences, and the watchtowers made it nearly impossible. But the idea of striking fear into the officers by showing that even the walls weren't enough, that became the spark. It began with tools smuggled in, sharpened scraps of metal, wires, makeshift ropes twisted from bedsheets. Inmates used screws loosened from bunks, fragments of mop handles, even pieces of the crumbling walls. Slowly, in secret, a plan took shape. One night, during a routine head count, guards noticed something strange, a vent cover loose, hanging at an angle. When they pried it open, they discovered a tunnel beginning to form, crudely dug, but real. Behind it, they found wires twisted into makeshift rope, shanks hidden in rags, and maps sketched onto scraps of paper. The discovery triggered a wave of panic. Alarms blared across the island. Units were searched top to bottom, every inch torn apart. But the bigger revelation wasn't the tunnel, it was what it meant. If inmates had the time, the tools, and the courage to plan a breakout in one of the most heavily guarded jails in America, then the system wasn't in control anymore. That night, rumors spread faster than the truth. Some said the escape was days away. Others claimed multiple tunnels existed. Guards looked at every vent, every corner, every shadow with suspicion. Inmates, meanwhile, wore silent smiles. Even if the escape had failed, the message was clear: Rikers' walls weren't strong enough to contain the darkness growing inside. And as dawn broke over the razor wire, everyone on the island knew the real danger wasn't whether someone would escape. It was what the inmates would try next. Hostage to the darkness. After the escape scare, Rikers Island was at its breaking point. The walls held, the fences stood, but inside, control was slipping like water through fingers. Guards walked their shifts in silence, knowing the eyes of hundreds of inmates followed every step. Inmates whispered in the shadows, knowing the next explosion could come at any moment. The tension finally snapped one afternoon during movement. A guard was escorting a small group of inmates back to their dorms when one man slipped a hidden shank from his sleeve. In an instant, the officer was grabbed, dragged against the wall, the blade pressed to his throat. The hallway froze. Radios screamed with urgent calls. Inmates cheered from their cells, fists pounding on steel doors. For those few terrifying minutes, the balance of power flipped. Rikers belonged to the inmates. The officer's eyes were wide with fear, his fellow guards shouting, weapons drawn but afraid to rush in. It ended with blood and smoke. The tactical unit stormed the corridor, shields raised, pepper spray hissing. The inmate was slammed to the ground, his blade clattering across the floor. The officer survived, shaken and scarred, but alive. The block was locked down tighter than ever. But the message had been sent. Rikers wasn't just violent. It wasn't just broken. It was a place where the system itself had become hostage to the chaos it created. The Island of Shadows. This is Rikers Island. A place built to hold but where control slips every day. A place where silence is survival, where gangs write the rules, and where every moment of calm is just the breath before another storm. We've seen riots that shook the walls, ambushes that scarred guards, fires that filled the air with smoke, and even escape plans scratched into the very bones of the island. Each event different, but all connected by one truth: the darkness of Rikers is not just in its cells, it's in its design, its culture, its very existence. To outsiders, Rikers is just a jail on an island in New York. But for those who've lived it, it's something far more haunting, a world cut off from the city it shadows, where violence is routine, silence is law, and survival is never guaranteed. The question isn't whether Rikers Island will see more blood, more riots, more darkness. The question is, how much longer can a place like this exist before it collapses completely? Until then, Rikers remains what it has always been: an island of shadows, hidden in plain sight, holding stories too dark to forget.